What if I told you that the team that is dominating Formula One right now could be using a system that deceives the FIA right before your eyes? Because yes, Mercedes is not only winning on the track, it is at the center of a controversy that could completely change the championship. After the Japanese Grand Prix, the FIA has focused on a trick in classification that many already describe as illegal, but which until now no one has been able to stop. The big question is, are we seeing brilliant engineering or the biggest regulatory gray area in years? Stay, because what Mercedes is doing is not normal, and when you understand how it works, everything changes. Mercedes has gone from being a team in reconstruction to becoming the absolute epicenter of controversy in Formula One, and the most shocking thing is that everything happens just when they return to the top of the championship, because after the Japanese Grand Prix they not only lead in points, they also lead in suspicions, in tensions within the paddock, and in a technical battle that could redefine the entire season. And this is where this story really begins, because what seemed like simply a performance improvement actually hides something much deeper. During the first races of the year there were already signs that the Mercedes car had something different, something that did not quite fit when you compared its behavior in qualifying against the rest, especially in key moments where the car seemed to gain stability almost artificially at corner entry, something that is not easy to achieve without sacrificing other areas of performance. But it wasn't until teams began analyzing data, images, and telemetry after Japan that everything began to take shape. The breaking point comes when the front wing system is publicly exposed, an element that in modern Formula One is absolutely critical, especially in qualifying, where every thousandth counts and where the driver's confidence in the front axle can make the difference between pole position and being out of the fight. And this is where Mercedes introduces its masterstroke, a system that in theory complies with the regulations, but in practice stretches it to a limit that no one had explored in this way. The FIA establishes a maximum time of 400 milliseconds for the wing to change between settings, a parameter that is electronically controlled, which in principle should prevent any type of manipulation. But Mercedes finds a way to play with that control system, not by breaking the rule directly, but by interpreting it in an extremely aggressive way. What they do is divide the movement into two phases, a first fast enough for the sensor to register that everything is within the legal limit, and a second that finishes the job outside the actual monitoring range. This detail completely changes the game, because it allows the car to better manage the aerodynamic load right at the most critical moment, the transition between straight and curve, where drivers normally have to deal with sudden changes in behavior. In the case of Mercedes, this transition is smoothed, the car becomes more predictable, and that translates into more confidence, more aggressiveness, and consequently better times in qualifying, especially on technical circuits like Suzuka, where each change of direction requires absolute precision. But the most important thing about this act is not only the system itself, but the context in which it appears, because Mercedes does not come to this situation as a desperate team looking for solutions, but as a championship leader that is willing to push the regulations to the limit to consolidate its advantage. And that completely changes the narrative, because we are no longer talking about isolated innovation, we are talking about a clear strategy to dominate, even if that means entering a gray area that makes the rest of the grid uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Ferrari, McLaren, and other teams are beginning to put pressure, not only because of the impact on performance, but because they understand that if this is allowed, a dangerous door opens where the regulations cease to be a clear barrier and become a field of constant interpretation. And that is where the tension escalates, because the FIA observes, analyzes, but does not act firmly, at least for now, leaving Mercedes in a position where it can continue exploiting this system without immediate consequences. This is the true beginning of the conflict, a championship where performance is no longer measured only in speed, but in who is able to best understand the limits of the regulations. And at this moment, Mercedes seems to be playing at another level. But if all this already seems serious, what's coming now changes absolutely everything, because Mercedes' problem is not only what they are doing, but what can happen when the FIA decides to act, or worse still, when it doesn't. As the days progress after the Japanese Grand Prix, the pressure within the paddock begins to escalate to a completely different level, because it is no longer just about technical suspicions. There are now teams that are directly questioning the legality of the system and demanding clear answers. Ferrari and McLaren, who are the main pursuers in the championship, understand that they are not only competing against a fast car, but against an interpretation of the regulations that is giving them a structural advantage to Mercedes. And this is where the FIA's real dilemma comes in, because technically Mercedes has not been declared illegal, but that does not mean that its system is clean from a competitive point of view. The Federation has initiated reviews, has analyzed data, has observed the behavior of the wing. but has not taken the definitive step of opening a formal investigation, and that inaction is what is generating even more tension. Because in Formula One there is something that weighs as much as the written regulations, and it is the so-called spirit of the regulations, that invisible line that separates innovation from cheating. And many within the paddock believe that Mercedes has already crossed it. The problem is that proving it is not so simple because the system is designed precisely to pass the controls, to appear legal in the official data, while on the track it provides a benefit that should not exist under normal conditions. This causes an extremely dangerous situation for the championship, because if the FIA does not act quickly, other teams could begin to copy the concept, entering into a kind of technological war where everyone tries to exploit the same legal loophole. And in this scenario, the regulations completely lose their control function, becoming a guide open to increasingly aggressive interpretations. Meanwhile, Mercedes plays a perfect game, because publicly they maintain a firm stance, without admitting any irregularity, defending that their design complies with all technical verifications. And this is where the narrative becomes even more uncomfortable, because if the FIA cannot prove otherwise, the team has free rein to continue using this system in qualifying, where it has already proven to be especially effective. But there is a detail that many are overlooking, and that is that these types of situations in Formula One rarely end without consequences. History has taught us that when a team pushes the limits too far, the FIA sooner or later responds, whether with a technical clarification, a directive, or even an immediate change in the regulations. And when that happens, the impact can be devastating, not only in performance but in the stability of the team within the championship. So right now we are at a critical point, a moment where everything can change from one weekend to the next. If the FIA decides to tighten the interpretation of the rule, Mercedes could suddenly lose one of its greatest weapons in classification. But if he doesn't, the message to the rest of the teams is clear. This is the new limit, and anyone who doesn't cross it is left behind. And that takes us to the next level of this story, because the real question is no longer what Mercedes is doing, but who will dare to stop them. And now we reach the point where everything explodes. Because in Formula One, when a technical controversy reaches this level, there is no turning back. Mercedes has built an advantage based on an extreme interpretation of the regulations, a move that, until now, has allowed them to dominate in qualifying and consolidate themselves as championship leaders. But that same advantage is what can become their greatest weakness, because the more visible the system becomes, the greater the pressure on the FIA to intervene. And when the Federation intervenes, it never does it halfway. The paddock is no longer in the suspicion phase, it is in the reaction phase. Rival teams aren't just scrutinizing Mercedes' system, they're preparing responses, either by replicating the concept or directly lobbying for it to be banned. And this is what marks the beginning of a possible technical war, where the championship stops being decided only on the track and begins to be defined in offices, meetings, and regulatory decisions. But here comes the most important twist in this whole story, because Mercedes is playing with fire. If the FIA decides to issue a technical directive clarifying that wing movement must be continuous and complete within 400 milliseconds, the dual-phase system would automatically be invalidated. And that wouldn't be a small adjustment, it would be a direct hit to the car's performance, especially in qualifying where they have built much of their advantage. Imagine it for a moment, a team that leads the championship, that has designed its performance around a key concept, and that from one weekend to the next is forced to modify it or eliminate it completely. The impact would not only be technical, it would be psychological, strategic, and competitive. Because in modern Formula One, losing a 10th in qualifying can mean losing positions, pace, strategy, and eventually the championship. And yet, the opposite scenario is just as dangerous. If the FIA does not act, Mercedes will not only maintain its advantage, but will force the rest to follow the same path, pushing the regulations into increasingly ambiguous territory. At that point, the category enters a dynamic where innovation stops being controlled and becomes a race to find the next loophole. So this is not just a technical case, it is a decisive moment for all of Formula One. Because what is decided here will set a precedent, mark the limit of what is allowed, and define how we will compete in this new era. Mercedes, meanwhile, continues to win, but under an increasingly larger shadow. And the ultimate question is no longer whether this trick is legal or illegal. The real question is how much longer can it survive before the entire system collapses, and when it does, who will pay the highest price? And in the end, it all comes down to this. Mercedes is not just fighting to win races, it is redefining the boundaries of what is acceptable in modern Formula One. What we have seen after the Japanese Grand Prix is not a simple technical controversy, It is a reflection of how the largest teams are capable of finding cracks in the regulations and turning them into competitive weapons, even when these cracks call into question the equality of the championship. Because here it's not just about a spoiler or milliseconds. It's about how far you are willing to go to win. Mercedes has shown once again that Formula One is not only one on the track, it is also one in the details, in the engineering, in the interpretation of the rules. But this time they have gone further, entering an area where the line between what is legal and what is questionable is practically invisible. And that is the real problem, because when that line disappears, the sport enters dangerous territory. And now it's your turn. Is this brilliant engineering taken to the limit? Or is this a trick that should never have been allowed? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.